welcome everybody to Sapir's webinar on Gen Z and Zionism, two Z words, with two contributors from our recent Friends and Foes issue, Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch of Stephen Wise Synagogue and Dr. Noam Weissman, Executive Vice President of OpenDor Media. I'm Ariella Saperstein. I'm Sapir's Associate Publisher, and I'm honored to moderate this conversation on a bit of a heavy topic for a Monday, whether the next generation of Jews will be Zionists. This has been, I think, to some degree, a perennial topic of conversation within the Jewish community for quite some time. But with the terrorist attacks of October 7th and with Israel's ongoing war in Gaza passing the 6-month mark, these questions, I think, are increasingly urgent. We should acknowledge also the Iranian attacks of Saturday night when the Islamic Republic launched more than 300 suicide drones, cruise and ballistic missiles at Israeli territory. Thankfully with minimal damage, but only thanks to Israel's strong air defenses and its allies. No doubt all of these events will come up in today's conversation. We'll be focusing in particular on Gen Z, and just so you don't have to look it up, that means those born between 1997 and 2012. So they're in their teens and their 20s today. But we'll be talking about many of the challenges from politics to technology that are impacting American Jews more broadly. Both Ami and Noam are wonderful educators in their various capacities. And they each, by the way, have podcasts of their own, which you should check out. And I'm very grateful that we could publish them in the pages of Sapir and get an opportunity to go more deeply with them today. Just a reminder, as with all Sapir webinars, that we'll take questions later in the hour. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your thoughts. I want to start this conversation with a broad question, I think, that can just help frame us, which is that you both have engaged with young people for a long time. So how has behavior, attitudes, and interest in learning changed over the past 15 to 20 years in your experience? And how are the larger societal forces that we're battling, whether it's technology, different pedagogical approaches, political polarization, et cetera, playing out in the world of Israel engagement?
Noam, go ahead. Go take that first.
All right, I'll start then. Thank you. And thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to publish in the journal and for the opportunity to have this conversation with you and Ami. Listen, on the one hand, human nature never changes. So human nature is something that continues to exist. We've had this for a few thousand years. On the other hand, we have a reality in which there's been an emerging technology over the last 15 plus years, social media, something that everyone's very aware of. And specifically, more recently, we have the story of TikTok, where you have 76% of 18 to 24-year-olds are TikTok users, compared to 7% if they're 65 years or older. Teens, we know, spend 10% of their waking hours on TikTok. So if this is the reality, then we know that young people are getting their information and consuming their content in a different sort of way. When I first started talking about this a number of years ago, that people will get their education on YouTube, on a platform like YouTube, people would laugh about that. How do you know that that's the case? Well, it has been the case for a long time. There's so many different YouTube channels out there, whether or not it's Origin of Everything, Crash Course, many others, obviously we have Unpacked. But the whole point is that young people are consuming their information and getting their learning in a different way than when I was growing up. And I could say that when I was growing up, when you were young, when I was younger, we didn't even necessarily Google things to figure things out. Eventually we started doing that. But the reality is that the iPhone has changed the way we all engage with information, the way we all engage with content, and really, therefore, the way we assimilate information and what we think to be true. So if that's the case, then we have to be paying attention to that changed reality of how people are consuming their content. But there's one second thing. The second thing is, like I said at the beginning, human nature never changes. And so if that's the case, human nature says, what does good education look like? And there are a lot of different ways that we have to be thinking differently about education, or really thinking, utilizing the best tools of education and making sure that we continue to do that when engaging with this generation and saying, yes, you might be growing up in the era of TikTok, in the era where YouTube seems older, in an era where Googling is a thing of the past. It's not really a thing of the past. And in an era where you're glued to social media in a different sort of way. But education still looks the way it needs to look. And that means, and we should get into this, that means it doesn't come across in a way that's indoctrinating. It doesn't come across in a way that's inoculating, but it has its own distinct field, and that field is called education. And I think that we make some problems for ourselves when we look at this generation and say, you're so different. We have no idea how to engage with you. We do know how to engage with them, and we have to make sure to utilize those tools and utilize educational psychology to do this well.
I would add, just from what I see from a synagogue perspective, I think I've been here now for 20 years. I think we're seeing fewer hours a week per student than we used to. And even then, if you take a look at in the non-Orthodox community, the three main centers of where Jewish identity is built, aside from the family, they're in synagogues, day schools, and summer camps. These are the three main institutions that build Jewish identity, I think. Of the three, I think synagogues are the central institution because they embrace, first of all, they embrace cradle to grave throughout an entire lifetime. And secondly, that's where most of the people are going to end up. I'm all in favor of day school, but most non-Orthodox kids are not going to get a day school education. More of them, but still far fewer than in synagogues, will end up in summer camps, Jewish summer camps. So for that reason alone, synagogues are the most important. And what we're seeing is that we have maybe 2, 3 at tops 4 hours a week, but usually much less time. And so when we're talking about identity formation, Jewish identity formation outside the state of Israel, where the entire environment is Jewish, you can imagine how challenging the situation is, because in order to build identity, one, you need to know something. I mean, you do need to convey data and information and material, you know, where we just don't simply have enough time. It's often at the end of the day, the kids are tired, they're on their way home to do 2 hours of homework. So there's just a function of being able to communicate data. But the second issue is even more important than the data, than what you know, is what you feel. Do you have a sense of belonging? And that's a lifelong process that also needs engagement, direct engagement on identity building and techniques that Noam understands better than me, but also just simply time and over a long period of time. So these are major challenges for us that go even beyond, you know, how people acquire information today than they say they did in Noam's generation or my generation. It's a substantial challenge for us. We need to not only invest expertise and time, but also the Jewish community as a community needs to invest far more financial resources in these three main centers where Jews acquire Jewish identity.
So technology and connection are two themes that I want to make sure we come back to, but you both just touched on, in different ways, the limitations of time in the current sort of educational system that we have, particularly outside of Jewish day schools, the distractions that young children have, the limitations of an Israel education perhaps only happening within the synagogue. But in the articles that you guys both wrote for Sapir, you also touched on different factors that might be contributing to the decrease in connection to Israel. And one which gets, I think, a lot of publicity, which Noam, you wrote about, was the extent to which we are being honest and nuanced about Israeli history and including different perspectives. And Ami, you wrote about something a little bit different, which was the focus that we tend to have on Tikkun Olam and the universalism that has brought to the lens toward Israel connection and Jewish identity at the expense of Jewish particularism, and instilling an appreciation for that. Are those, Ammiel, I'll ask you first, are those two things different? Are they in opposition to each other? Do you see one as more important than the other?
Those two things being particularism and universalism?
Universalism, the impact of privileging universalism over particularism as a contributing factor to lessening connection with Israel, versus what Noam wrote about, which is not being perhaps nuanced and honest enough about the various perspectives around Israeli history.
Yeah. So let me deal with the first issue first, and then pause, see what Noam wants to weigh in on, and then I'll be happy to expand on the second issue. This question of universalism and particularism, we need to realize any authentic understanding of Judaism requires us to absorb the basic fundamental fact of Judaism, which is, from the beginning, which is we were grounded, anchored in, and rooted in what we now call today Jewish particularism, what the Bible calls the covenant of the Jewish people. And that's how that is how we acquire our Jewish status. Jewish status is acquired by our belonging to the Jewish people. Most of us are born into the Jewish people. The rest of us choose the Jewish people. This people, from the very beginning, from the first words of Judaism, has a universal task. It is not simply for self-aggrandizement or for ego or for conquest or for expansion. The point of the selection of the Jewish people, as we read in the 12th chapter of Genesis, is to be a blessing to the entire world. And all the nations of the world, all the families of the earth, should bless themselves through the Jewish family. So Judaism is a blend between Jewish particularism and what we call universalism, which today is often characterized by the term tikkun olam, which is a Hebrew phrase which means repair of the world. Both are fundamental to Judaism. If you take one of those elements away or diminish one of those elements in favor of the other, you have truncated Judaism and made it into something that much smaller than it is and that it always saw itself to be. And I think what we saw in modern times, and this goes back to the development of liberal Judaism in the West in the 19th century. The Reform movement itself was founded on this principle that the era of Jewish particularism was usurped, is over, because Western emancipation and Western enlightenment is a more highly developed, socially evolved form of Jewish aspirations, what is commonly called prophetic aspirations, than Jewish particularism. That's often associated with not only nationalism, but a form of nationalism that tends to be narrow and aggressive and egotistical. And so it was very common in the 19th century and throughout until Israel was created, really, in particular amongst liberal American Jews and liberal Western Jews. And it goes beyond the Reform movement. It's everybody who considered themselves liberal, that we placed our faith in Western enlightenment over and above, and the Reform movement itself said, we no longer consider ourselves a nation, but simply a religious community. And therefore, all of the components of Jewish particularism were either minimized or discarded. And that process existed for decades. What I concluded later in my career, it took me about 30 years of my career, maybe 25 years, to really absorb, and I think I'm right, I haven't studied this empirically, but I think I'm right now, is that in most of the 20th century, we abandoned this notion of we are no longer a nation. I think primarily because, one, the rise of the Zionist movement, and the Zionist movement itself became strengthened because it was clear that Western emancipation, Western enlightenment could not solve the problem of anti-Semitism. The entire 20th century was filled with existential threats against the Jewish people and were perceived by us as existential threats, beginning with pogroms in Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, through the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, the creation of the State of Israel, the Six-Day War, the 73 War, to a certain degree, the fight for Soviet Jewry. And so all of these forced all Jews, including liberal Jews, back into the Jewish fold. In the meantime, and I'll end with this, in the meantime, there have been two generations that have been born. One, who have lived mostly with a center-right government in Israel, but even more importantly than that, do not perceive any form of existential threats against them or against the Jewish people, notwithstanding the recent rise of anti-Semitism in our country. And two, if anything, when they look to the Middle East, they look at the state of Israel as exercising undue force in often from their perspective, immoral or excessive, disproportional ways. And so this feeling that now that two generations have of no existential threats against the Jewish people has really brought us back to the original default position of liberal American Jewry, which is to emphasize universalism either at the expense of Jewish peoplehood or at the negation of Jewish peoplehood. And I think that's a big part of where we are now.
I just want to comment on something you said there, Ami, which was I noted, which was a great point in your piece as well about the particularism and universalism. When I read your piece, what I was thinking was, Jonathan Haidt's research about selfish versus groupish, that people are willing to sublimate their individual desires or will or whatever is better for them in order to do something for the group. And there's something that in overemphasizing the universal aspect of Judaism, when we do that and we shirk or we ignore that aspect of Judaism, that's the particularism, people are going to find something else to latch onto and develop that group together. Whatever that group is, it used to be Judaism, particularism with universalism. But if we're going to negate particularism, then the people who are negating that are going to find something else to latch onto and hold on to. And that is something that I think we see happening. That was just a thought that I had after reading your piece. And I think that the ideal, the newest, I love synthesis. I love dialectic, right? I grew up in a modern Orthodox world that likes to think about dialectic, which is a word that is we obsess over, and it's probably not used in every other context. But the idea of synthesis, the idea of there's this and there's this. How do you weigh these things together? How do you balance these things? There used to be Torah and Mada, right? There's learning Torah and then worldly knowledge, or other versions were Torah and Parnasa. How do you manage both learning Torah and also earning a living? And then I think that today's, and thinking about what you just said, today's challenge is going to be the blending or the dialectic or whether or not there is a synthesis of this thesis particularism, this antithesis of universalism. And will there be a synthesis, or will there always be this hanging uncertainty about how to deal with them, but they kind of just reside in the same individual and we go back and forth? And I don't know, but that's something you really got me thinking about.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. No, I just to answer that, just to fortify what you said, my understanding of Judaism is it is this blend of universalism and particularism, both existing at the same time, that goes to the heart of the Jewish genius and goes to the essence of the Jewish contribution in the world. Yeah. That we should be able to do both and be both, because human nature is about first caring about your inner circle the most, because that's just the nature of the way we live our lives and social lives, but never to forget what are our obligations to all of humanity. And from a religious perspective, from a biblical perspective, the obligation towards every human being is rooted in the axiomatic principle of creation, that God breathed into each and every human being the breath of life. Each and every person is created in God's image, and therefore we have equal sanctity and equal dignity.
Absolutely. Love that. I want to take that point and kind of just riff off of that and about Ariel's earlier question about this word nuance that comes up and that I've become very associated with, part of my brand, again, to use a modern parlance. I want to reflect on this for a minute. I think that this concept gets misconstrued. The nuance is not about, and in my piece, I'm not making the argument about some mushy middle necessarily, or some lack of gravitas, lack of anchored, I'm looking actually at the exact opposite. What I want to make the argument for is more, not less. And what I mean by that is more knowledge, more passion, more compassion. And if you could combine all of those things together, what you have is someone who understands things significantly better. What we saw in the last 25 to 30 years is that the establishment education approach, and I say this with respect in the sense that it was growing, it was new. In the early 2000s, Second Intifada is going on, and people are wondering, and I'm in high school, and people are wondering, how do you teach about Israel now? And so what people did is, it was a new field, and I'm sure there were writers beforehand that talked about this emerging field before the early aughts, but the whole field was about, how do you make sure that these kids are going to graduate high school if they're in a Jewish day school? Let's say, Ami, they are in the Jewish day school. Let's say they are in the synagogue school, wherever they are. And their goal always was to make sure that we graduated knowing, quote unquote, the truth, right? The truth, as it were. So it almost became a jingle, right? With the world of Israel advocacy. When they say occupied, you say disputed. When they say Der Yassin, you say never happened. And what ended up happening for so many of us, and there's article after article after article about this, there's nothing new that I'm saying, is we Googled things eventually, and we explored ideas. And what we noticed, all of us, and we see in the field, is that, wait a second, you're so good at Tanakh education. You're so good at Talmud education. You're so good at the Beit Midrash experience, Jewish world, in which you allow people, not just allow people, you demand from people to cultivate their thinking, to utilize their brains, their minds, their hearts, to come together, to provide something new, to create something new, to be innovative. And then when the topic came to Israel, then it was, hear idea, recite back, make sure you say the right thing. And that, I think, that sideline Judaism, and now just thinking what you said, Ami, what I'm seeing is that sideline, that I would call that a sideline approach to Judaism, where you're being passive. And the whole idea of Zionism, right? I'm going to quote from you. The whole idea of Zionism was that there would be an indomitable will of the Jewish people to survive and prosper. It represents hope, a testament to the remarkable resilience and dogged determination of the Jews. Never again would Jews be powerless, prey to marauding murderers, and more and more and more. The whole idea is that Jews would never be passive. And yet when we learned about Israel, the way it was done was always done in a very passive way, in a very neutered way, in a way that said, you have to tell people exactly the party line. And what I'm making an argument for is that approach may have worked at some point in time, maybe it didn't. But I'm confident about a few things in life. People like to make fun of me that I like to waver and I'm not sure. And I see this side, I see that side, I see this side. I see this very clearly. If you're doing education, you have to do education. Don't pretend you're doing education, but really do advocacy. I have no problem with this world of advocacy. I think not just no problem. I think it's amazing. I think it's critical. I think we have to be doing advocacy in lots of parts of our lives. But when we're learning about ideas in the synagogue, in the camp, in the day school, when we're learning and we are exploring ideas, we have to utilize the best approaches to education, and we know how to do that well. And what I've termed is this thing called the Mikra'ot Gedolot approach to Israel education. And what that means is, if you show a Bible to somebody, it's different than any other group's Bible. You see a Bible, you see 5 lines, right? You see 5 lines, and then the rest is Rashi versus Ibn Ezra, Sforno versus Chizkuni, Rashbam and Ramban. And that is the liveliness of debate. I think that this generation demands that sort of approach to learning because it's always been part of our DNA. And I think from what I've seen, this is anecdotal, but it's to a degree empirical as well. Unpacking Israeli History, which is one of the podcasts that I host on the story of Israel, we have, almost 1.5 million downloads at this point, and the number of people who are reaching out saying, "Oh my gosh, I feel so much better being able to think that you trusted me, that you viewed me as the subject and not the topic as the subject, and you treated me with that sort of respect, and you allowed me to explore." And when we allow people to explore and we give them, exactly like you said, Ami, the anchor of the text, of the content, to make sure that there's something to actually have a conversation about, then what that does is it humanizes the other and it puts them in a position where they can actually think deeply about an issue. And if they think deeply about an issue and they feel deeply about an issue, then the result is more content, more education, more passion, more compassion. And you could combine all those together. I think you have a very healthy individual.
I'm good with that. I think that's really good. I would have loved to have had you as one of my educators when I was young. It would have been good. You strike me as somebody who understands the mind and the heart of young people as well. I would add a couple of things. One, personally, I believe we are who we are first, and then we rationalize it. That is, we have a sense of who we are and to whom we belong. That is just that it comes to us outside of book learning and reading. It just is absorbed by our environment, by our family, or by our community. And I think, since I said already, I think that's where Judaism starts. I think when it comes to the crises facing the Jewish people, that's the essence of where it starts. This is something that affects me personally. I personally, while I listen, it's hard to be a congregational rabbi or a communal leader at any time, but especially during such polarized times. And so I encourage people to disagree and to debate, and including with their rabbis. That's the whole point. If they don't, then I'm always suspicious that they don't really care, or they're not listening. So all of that is good. But from my perspective, personally, I've always said, I do not consider myself objective. That's not my role, to be objective. I'm a partisan. I'm not, let me say, rather than objective, I'm not neutral. I'm a partisan for the Jewish people. And I want everybody to know that that's where I start. Now, do I apply standards of objectivity or reason? Of course, but I'm always going to end up at the end of the day promoting the welfare of the Jewish people. And even when I personally express criticism, it's for the purposes of what I consider to be the welfare of the Jewish people. The second thing I would say about Israel is, in particular now, and it's just so darn complicated. And as I said before, so much of this is about emotions. I really do think that everything we can possibly do as a community to get young people over to Israel and have an Israel experience is really the key. I see this for myself. I lived in Israel for 7 years. I've had positions in Israel that, with relationship to Israel, that took me back and forth over the last 30 years regularly. I was just there 2 or 3 weeks ago. Israel does something to you on the deepest level of identity formation. And there too, that we have a very healthy debate in the Jewish community. What should young people experience, and what should they see when they get to Israel? But I'm less afraid of that and less concerned about that, because Israel does its magic on anybody who has an open heart and gets to Israel. And from that perspective, I think it's more important than ever that we figure out a way in the Jewish community to recruit and invest whatever resources we can to bring as many young people as possible to Israel as we can.
Always a good, but also the most expensive strategy. I want to pick up on something you mentioned a minute ago, Ami, about political polarization, and push you, Noam, a bit on the pedagogical approach here, especially because you work in the digital space, which is very interesting. On the one hand, it's a way to reach many, many people. Obviously, it's the most scalable kind of educational approach that we can have these days. On the other hand, it can often feel like technology and social media are our enemy. People have really short attention spans. Technology feeds off of polarization and extreme views. It's anti-education in the sense that people feel like they can just Google anything and easily find information or disinformation. So why do they actually need to learn anything? And a lot of what's on social media is also framed around activism rather than education. And it's sort of ironic, perhaps, that the Jewish community has moved away from advocacy, as you discussed, toward education. But it feels like young people have very much moved towards activism over being educated. And you pointed this out in your essay when you talked about the lack of knowledge that many of us have. And despite the fact that we can be very confident in our positions on things, and that I saw actually a poll that Harvard did of Gen Z in October, just not too long after the October 7th attacks, that found that, nearly half of Gen Z, and this was the general population, not Jews, but nearly half of Gen Z thought that Israel still ruled over Gaza. But they were very comfortable taking positions that, that the Palestinians were not responsible for the attacks because of ongoing oppression and things like that. So how do you bring nuance and depth of education in a way that resonates for young people and that they might respond to in an era where they're also existing amid all of this cacophony of everything else, particularly in technological spaces?
So I think there are a few different ways to do this. One is, and I could talk for a very long time about this. So what we do is we have a number of different audiences. We have our YouTube channels, Unpacked, Today Unpacked, Big Jewish Ideas, where we're trying to reach 18 to 34-year-olds. Then we have Unpacked for Educators, which is a platform that's for synagogue schools, for day schools, for camps, for trip providers, where it provides curricula and lesson plans. And we launched a new platform, or we're launching it this summer, actually a new platform for non-Jewish schools that we're going to be launching this summer. Very excited about that. Very important. For each of these, we follow the same principles. I think that one of the, I'm reflecting out loud right now, okay? I think that one of the mistakes that we make as a Jewish community is trying to solve things that we have no way to possibly solve for, instead of solving things that we absolutely have a way to solve for. And I think that that's part of human psychology. It's much easier to say and to complain about things that are happening outside my house than to solve for the things that are happening inside my house. So I don't think that we're ever going to be able to compete, the Jewish people are ever going to be able to compete with the 15 million of us, no matter how scrappy and strong we are. The 50 million are never going to be able to compete with the 2 billion plus Muslims. I'm not saying this is just a Muslim-Jewish battle, but it is partially that. We're never going to be able to compete with the billions of hashtags that say stand with Palestine compared to the few hundred million that say stand with Israel. We're never going to be able to do good education if it is the case that we're expecting the algorithm to boost all of us and make sure that people, whether it's on the right, having their hot takes, they're the Tucker Carlsons of the world, and then people are very excited about that because it gets our heart rate going and either makes us angry or makes us happy. That's not the goal. It's not the goal. Or the same thing happening on the left, right? That's not the goal. Our goal is to say this is my goal. We have 15 million people. What are we going to do with these 15 million people to educate them? Now, what we saw 10 plus years ago, and this is fascinating, is there was a video. I won't say who because whatever. There was a video and it was about the truth about the West Bank. The truth about the West Bank. Okay, thank you. The truth. We learned the truth by the West Bank. By the way, whenever someone says the truth about something, I'm not sure that it's always the type of thing that everyone is suspicious of. And then someone did something else. They did the response to the truth, the real truth about the West Bank. And so what we see happening is that for every action, Newton's third law, right? There's an equal and opposite reaction that people will take. So if you're going to be sarcastic in your content and you're going to be aggressive in your content, then people will also make sure to be equally sarcastic, equally aggressive in response. So what we have to be doing is we have to follow good educational principles to get people intrinsically motivated. And we're actually seeing the fact that you're able to educate people, even if it's more than 2 minutes. One of our videos, our longest video, is around 27 minutes on YouTube. It's called something like "What's Life Really Like in Gaza," right? And where we worked with another great organization, and the average view time within our target demo is around 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes on that YouTube video. That means that young people are actually watching videos. They have to follow certain good educational principles. Number one, intrinsic motivation. How do you get intrinsic motivation? Through 3 different things. You have to provide people with choice, you have to provide people with curiosity, and an appropriate challenge. If you're going to give them choice, you're going to give them curiosity, you're going to give them an appropriate challenge, they're going to want to stay on. And when you write a script, what you're able to do then, therefore, is with curiosity, is what we do is our formula, just to let everyone know, the irresistible question to start off. And when you have this irresistible question, people are interested in figuring out what that answer is to that question. So I think that when we think about what we're trying to accomplish and saying, hey, listen, social media is doing all these awful things. Yes, that is true. But there is also a way, and I make this argument in this up here article, that we can reach every single young Jew in the US, in Australia, in the UK. We could reach all of them through the synagogues, through the day camps, through the sleepaway camps, through the day schools, through the congregational schools, and through Birthright, through Route 1, through Hillel, and direct to consumer with this approach. So I think it's eminently doable. And I think that all of us should be spending our time thinking much more about, can we solve this? The answer is yes. Now let's solve it, as opposed to we can't solve this because of the evils of social media and the very fact that we are tiny people compared to billions of people. And if we do that, we're going to have this Sisyphean approach to Hasbara. And that's why I just want to say one more thing here. One of my favorite stories ever is in the early 80s, one of my funders met with Menachem Begin. And Menachem Begin was going through a really tough time. It was the story of Sabra and Shatila. Let's make sure we all know that story. And this donor of mine said to Menachem Begin, Prime Minister, I want to give you a $50,000 monthly check to make sure that you have Hasbara. Prime Minister Begin went back to this donor. This donor told me the story and said, take your $50,000. Thank you, American. Thank you so much. And invest in Jewish education. Invest in education. I don't need your Hasbara. Now, whether he's right or wrong, separate question. But that's the point. There is a way to do Jewish and Israel education, and it's our job to think, what can we solve? Not, it can't be solved. Now what?
Okay, we're going to get to audience questions in a couple of minutes, but I do want to make sure that we touch on, at least to some degree, the potential impact, if we think there's an impact on this question in the wake of October 7th. Ami, you mentioned earlier the sense that previous generations of Jews had of existential threats towards Israel, having lived through some of the wars and the peril that Israel faced in 1967, for example, and in 1973. But younger generations of Jews, as you noted, have grown up not having experienced that, seeing Israel as a relatively strong military power. Even in the wake of 10/7, we've seen that as well. And Daniel Gordis actually recently posited that Israel is going to be moving from Athens to Sparta. And that is a shift that American Jews will have to internalize and deal with. But at the same time, we also saw after October 7th, a lot of Jews who felt very connected to their Jewish identity and to Israel in new ways. And we're displaying that in different ways. Anecdotally, we've also seen an increase in desire to work in the Jewish community. So I'm wondering, you work particularly with young rabbis, and you launched a fellowship recently for early career rabbis around Zionism. I wonder how you've seen this playing out in terms of people's interest and ability and courage to perhaps be more outwardly Zionist, and if there are ways in which we should be thinking about sort of seizing on that opportunity.
I think, broadly speaking, what I've noticed since October 7th is three basic groups in the American Jewish community. The first group is the hardcore anti-Zionists. They support BDS. They have moved with the liberal community towards a much harder, maybe we can call it progressive approach to social issues and social justice. And I don't think that group has dramatically expanded since October 7th, but I think their position has hardened. I think that group has hardened, and part of their critique against Israel involves the establishment, the Jewish establishment, the organized Jewish community, who they consider to be unduly supportive of Israel. And therefore, I think, and according to the surveys that I see, maybe 15, at most 20% of American Jews are in that category. So it's a noticeable minority, but a small minority. And while I'm open to everybody, and I would welcome anybody, I don't ask anybody what their views are before they come and join the synagogue or want to pray in the synagogue or come to a class or even talk to me. But I suspect, because part of their worldview is a critique against the Jewish establishment, that we're not likely to see too many of those people for the foreseeable future. I think that they will be distanced from American Jewry for a long time. I don't know if forever, that's a long time, but for a decade or two for sure, until they start raising their families. But that's the minority of American Jews. The majority of American Jews, call it 80%, are supportive of Israel to various degrees. They want to be supportive of Israel. Many of them consider Israel to be an important component of their own Jewish identity. However, with respect to the first group, the younger, you mentioned this before, Ariella, the younger you go, the higher the percentages of younger American Jews who are anti-Zionists or are such critics of Israel that their criticism overwhelms any other sentiment that they feel or that they express publicly. So it is a increasingly urgent challenge for us in the Jewish community, because the younger you go, the higher those numbers are. As I said, the rest are supportive of Israel, but within that group of supportive of Israel, and that's the group that I primarily see and that most of us primarily see, because they're almost self-selecting. They come to synagogues because they want to be in synagogues, and they don't have the kind of criticism against the Jewish establishment that the other group had. Within that group, however, I sensed until Saturday night, and we'll see what Saturday night in the aftermath, the attacks by Iran, whether that changes anything in the long term, and much of that will depend on what kind of reaction and what cascade of events that triggers. But what I'm detecting is within the group supportive of Israel, there is a growing number of American Jews, especially liberal Jews, who are increasingly challenged by Israel's prosecution of the war, and increasingly troubled by the suffering and the hardships imposed on the Palestinian side. So I think that group, that we're not likely to lose too many Jews from that group, and that the majority of American Jews will continue to be very supportive of Israel. But we have some substantial challenges moving forward. And since I don't see the crisis passing anytime soon, first of all, we won't recover until Israelis recover. And Israelis won't begin to heal from the trauma until the hostage issue is resolved one way or the other, hopefully for better, but if for worse, at least that it would be resolved. And the fighting ends and the immediate danger is lifted. And then we should expect to see in Israel all the commissions of investigation, the accountability that needs to be applied in Israel on both the political as well as the military levels. So I foresee that this period that we're in, we are likely to be in for a long time, and it should impact on how we view the next decade in all areas of Jewish life, including Jewish education.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to get through a bunch of them, and I'm going to ask you both to be as succinct as possible and try to answer in maybe a minute or so we can get through a lot of them, because there are a lot of good questions here. So Roz Shorenstein asks about parents. She says, how can Jewish grassroots parents try to affect a comparable political power at the level of local school boards and city councils? I think we've seen, I'll just add to that, that there's been an uptick in parent activism around a number of political issues in schools, which may be where she's drawing some inspiration. So interested if you have views on that, but also just if I can take the liberty of expanding the question a bit more generally. I'm sure you both have a lot of engagement with parents as well, and would be curious for your thoughts on how we can better engage parents on these issues. Noam, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go very quickly here. There's a lot of potential and opportunity here. First of all, in New York, there's a whole, I don't know the name of it, but a leadership council that post 10/7, they all get together. They have a big WhatsApp group and they organize events in order to make sure that everyone comes together to deal with these questions at their elite private schools or wherever their kids might go to. That's number one. Number two is, I really think that we have to make sure that education is not just in the hands of educators, but it's in the hands of parents. And so regardless of what's taking place in the school, we can't ever outsource our education to educators. Everyone has access to all of Israeli history, to the entire story of Zionism, to all of Jewish history. It's online. It's there for everyone. And then there are ways to then talk about it at your Shabbat table, at a Thursday night dinner with pizza, whatever it is. There's so many different ways to do that. So again, I'm going to stick with what I said earlier. Try to control what you can control, and don't try to control the things that are going to take years to push forward. Now, if people are excited about that and they're enthusiastic about pushing that boulder up that hill, then make that your project. But otherwise, those are the two other recommendations that I have.
Ami?
Two brief comments on parents. Number one, I perceive a growing concern on the part of parents with respect to their teenagers and young adults in their 20s. We have seen since October 7th a steady stream of parents who have come to consult with us and talk with us that the connection with their children is getting more and more difficult, up to a point where parents have told us that they can't have discussions with their kids about the Middle East or about Israel at all, either because it will cause a rupture of the relationship, or they it's completely unproductive, and the families have either become estranged, and we've heard of those phenomena as well, or people agree not to speak about it. So we're a week before the Passover Seder. Generations are going to come together. It will be interesting, and I hope we do get some data, some information from what's going on around Seder tables.
Yep.
The second thing about political activism that I would mention, and I've been part of that here in New York as well. It goes without saying, we have hundreds of families who are part of the educational system in New York, public and private schools. Personally, I believe, and this is what I advise parents, is to be as active as they possibly can, and to try not to do it alone, but to form groups. If there are non-Jewish parents who are also willing to be part of that, that's even better. But for at least the Jewish parents who have issues with the way Israel is taught, or what somebody said, or some tolerance of anti-Israel or anti-Jewish views in school or on social media, my own advice is nothing should be ignored and everything should be engaged. And that's the kind of pressure that we need to put on administrators who do respond to that kind of pressure.
Okay, we have a number of questions that I'm going to combine about essentially reaching Jewish students where they are. There's an anonymous attendee who asks actually about how we restore trust in Jewish educational spaces to bring them back. But there are also several questions noting that many members of Gen Z don't go to shul, they don't belong to Hillel, they don't know a lot about Judaism. Lauren Blatt asks, how can assimilated Jewish students be reached? Ed Beck also asked, how do we reach Gen Z where they are and get them to understand the priority of embracing Jewish identity among a lot of other competing priorities in their life. Ami, you want to start?
Let me just say from my perspective, what I do on a daily basis. And, you know, we might be seeing thousands of people. There are thousands of souls in this one congregation, let alone all of the people we're trying to influence on podcasts and, you know, webinars like this and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, I would state what to me is obvious, and then I'm going to leave the rest of the issue to Noam. We personally, I and our staff here cannot influence people who don't want to be influenced. If they're not going to, if parents are not going to send their kids to a Jewish environment, then we're obviously not going to be able to reach them beyond, you know, throwing out some kind of podcast and hoping that somebody listens. So for those of us online who care about the Jewish identity of their kids and their kids' descendants, it is imperative to begin the Jewish identity formation process from birth, even before in utero, in order to ensure that there's a strong Jewish identity. And because the longer you wait, the harder it is to engage.
I mean, love what you're saying. Love what you're saying. There's this line that we've been saying for a long time. The battle is not antipathy. The battle is apathy. The battle is not difference of opinions. The battle is indifference. And that's where that is tough. That's really tough. You know, to think of the 4 children at the Passover Seder, you know, the Rasha, the one who's evil, is so engageable. Let's engage with the Rasha. It's the one who seems to be disinterested or is on the side. That's like, that's the battle. Is one student of mine who converted from Judaism to Islam actually said to me, I'm going to be going to Passover Seder and I'm the Tom. That's how much I don't care anymore. I was like, oh, in my heart, right? But that's a challenge. That is a real challenge. But we also have to do 2 other things. There are ways to reach them in both practically and philosophically. Practically, we can actually target young people based on interests with technology. If they're listening to certain types of podcasts or watching certain types of YouTube videos, we can make content that targets them directly, right? That is one very practical thing that we can do and that we do to make sure that we're reaching that demo. And the second thing is more hashkafic, more is worldview. When we're speaking to these people, something that I encourage parents all the time, ask more questions. Demonstrate that you get them, not that you agree with them, but that you get them, that you understand them, that they matter to you, that their opinions matter to you. The thing that people care about most in the world is being cared about. And if they're able to know that, like, you care, you hear them, you understand them, that's going to be a very easy way to then get into the conversation.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take this question about Passover, since that's next week. And Ami, you had touched on this a bit, and I'm actually going to expand the question as well because I intended to end on this note. Anyway, I think a lot of us are thinking about the Seder next week and this holiday that is centered around freedom while hostages remain in Gaza and Israel is at war seems very complicated this year. And there's been a lot written already about things that we might do differently at our Seder. So I want to ask first whether you're thinking about that. And second, I will ask the question that Barry Jacobson asked, which is, what would you offer to families who are either struggling to entice Gen Z young people to come to the Seder table, or conversely are anxious about the way in which Gen Zers may participate in ways that feel threatening to Shalom Bayit and the spirit of the Seder based on their attitudes, absorbed memes, criticisms, etc. of Israel and Zionism?
Well, we also have to answer the question, will Gen Z be Zionists?
Yes or no?
I think that's a really important question. The answer is it depends. It really depends, and it's up to us to figure out what that looks like. But I think that whether or not they are or they aren't, they have to be, and we have to be. And so we have to consistently make sure that we come up with that playbook to ensure that next generation will be Zionists. And that they understand what Zionism is, and they actually have those definitions, and they could, and it's not the same thing as being pro-Israel. It's not pro-Israelism. It's Zionism. And Ami is a phenomenal leader who's cultivating that in his synagogue, and we're trying to do the same sorts of things. But we have to be very intentional about that. Sorry, that was a commercial, but I want to say that because that's what this topic is, and we have to figure out a way to do that. So back to your question. Sorry, Ariella. And you could jump in.
I'll say very briefly, and then let you wrap up, Noam. First of all, we've also seen, along with a polarization and a distancing from Israel, a certain hardening of positions, as I mentioned before, with those three groups. We have also seen many Jews return to exploring their Judaism. We have seen a noticeable increase in everything related to the synagogue here. We've heard of noticeable increases in a heightened Jewish curiosity about Judaism and participation with Jewish rituals and in the Jewish community. So that's something to pay attention to as well, and that should be cultivated, because we need to take advantage of that, of whatever caused that. And I think October 7th obviously played a big role, and the spread of anti-Semitism around the country. I think we need to pay attention to that and encourage that and cultivate that. Specifically, and this will be my last word, with respect to the Seder table. Look, first, I think everyone should be saying a prayer for the hostages' release. I don't consider that to be controversial at all. And I hope that people recite a prayer for the hostages at their Seder table, and not only at their Seder table. We do it every Shabbat here in our synagogue. Beyond that, family relations are sacred in Judaism, and in my view, they supersede arguing back and forth to the extent of a rupture in the family around the Seder table or in other settings. So if in fact you can't talk about the Middle East for want of a rupture around the table and some kind of either temporary scene or long-lasting estrangement, don't do it. Avoid it. Stay connected with your families. And I will end with Chag Pesach Sameach. I want to wish everybody a good Seder and easy, hopefully easier time for the Jewish people in the coming period.
There's a time for celebration. There's a time for exploration. The time Passover is a time for celebration and storytelling, not a time for politicizing anything, even if it doesn't feel like that. I love the idea of leaving a seat at the table. That's a symbolic sort of thing to say, like the Chatuvim, the people who are, to the hostages, and making sure that we're thinking about them, having yellow ribbon, talking about Israeli voices. And we have a choice right now. The Jewish world has a choice right now. Is 10/7 going to be a second intifada moment in which there was more divisiveness than we've ever seen in the Jewish people around Israel post second intifada? Or is 10/7 going to be that Soviet Jewry moment that is galvanizing? And I think that we have to figure out how to be galvanizing and not be divisive. And that is my message to everyone on for this upcoming Passover. So wishing everyone a meaningful and a freilichen Passover.
Amen. Thank you for the call to action to end us. And thank you both so much, both for contributing to Sapir such thoughtful pieces. and for taking an hour out of the day to be with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining. The next Sapir webinar, which will be the last associated with the Friends and Foes issue, is on May 2nd with Coleman Hughes, talking about his article regarding anti-Semitism and Black radicalism. So I hope you will join that. You can sign up at sapirjournal.org. And the recording of this will also be up on our website within a couple of days. So hopefully you will all share it with friends and colleagues who were not able to join us today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.